Today I'm going to use this leftover piece of crowbar to make a hook knife, which is a carving knife that has a curved blade, so it allows you to dig into the surface the same way you would use a carving gouge. These come in all sizes, but I want to try making a fairly large one that'll allow me to carve out chair seats, bowls, and large spoons. I forge most of my tools out of crowbars and coil springs, which is essentially the same type of steel. And when you get to the end of the crowbar, and you don't have enough to make something like a chisel, you wind up with these little bits. And I save them because they come in handy for making a cutting edge for another tool or for making small projects like this one. First thing you need to do, of course, is to straighten them out. And then here I'm cutting off the forked end of the crowbar, which I can't use for the knife. It's funny how quickly you get used to things. I've been spending a lot of time at the museum where I volunteer, and as you know, I use the rounded edges of my anvil to draw out the metal, and their anvil's really chewed up, so the only usable edge is up here by the hardy hole. So even though I'm back in my home shop, I just started forging out this knife up near the hardy hole. So it took me a couple of heats to sort of wake up that I was at home and I should be using the radiused edges that I normally use on my anvil. I do have a radiused edge back here, but it's not as radiused as I like, and it's really awkward to get to. So again, I'm just amazed at how long it took me to realize that I should be working at the other end of the anvil. So here I am back where I should be. This knife is going to have a hidden tang, and that's what I'm forging out right now. The tang has a two-sided taper, so the thickness of the taper is flat and the two sides taper into a point. I want something that locks into the handle, but I don't want to create a splitting wedge. So I just have a taper on two sides so I can orient the grain the right way so I can hammer it into the handle and it'll be a nice tight fit, but there'll be less risk of splitting the block. And as I've mentioned in other videos, I treat every piece of scrap steel like it's the most miserable, brittle, temperamental piece of steel out there. So I stay within a very narrow forging range. I don't get the steel too hot. I don't forge it too low, and it goes back in the fire all the time. I don't try to get too much work done in any one heat. I just take my time and work myself through the process. Here I flip the knife blank around, so I'm holding on to the tang with the tongs and I'm forging up towards the cutting edge. Here I'm just sizing things up. I'm guessing that I don't need to forge out too much more bar to get all the material that I need for this hook knife. The tang is pretty much to its final shape, and I'm going to gain a little bit of length on that when I do the final forging on it. And I have about enough material for the blade because it's going to get at least a third longer when I thin it down to its final thickness. So I'm going to be left with a short piece that I'm going to need to cut off. I decided to cut the bar off instead of forging it out into a usable shape that I could cut off and use later, because now that I've cut it off, it's a hex bar, so I'm going to see it in the stockpile and I'm going to recognize it as a section of crowbar. If I had turned it into a flat bar or a longer length of square bar or something, I would have lost track of it, and I probably would have used it thinking that it was a piece of hot rolled steel. Now that I have the blank cut to length, I'm going to be forging from the tip of the knife back to the tang. Even though I'm rough forging this blank and I am trying to thin it down quite a bit, the final thickness is going to be quite a bit thicker than the finished blade. This is one situation where you do not want to forge it right down to its final dimensions. The outside surface of a forged blank tends to have less carbon than the inside of the metal because of the oxidation and scaling in the fire. So you want to make sure that you leave enough material to grind away to get back to clean metal. If you forge the blade right down to its final thickness, it'll probably still be a usable blade, but the edge retention is most likely not going to be what it should be. So when you're working with a steel that doesn't have a really high carbon content to begin with, you want to do all that you can to maximize the potential of that steel. Here I flip the knife around again and I'm forging from the wide end of the tang down to the point. These next few heats are just going to be to refine the shape of the tang and to make sure that everything's even. Here I flip the knife blank around again and I'm working on the blade. I'm basically doing the same thing, only this time I'm going to be a lot more careful how I'm hammering. The tang going into the handle can have a fairly rough forging because that helps it to stay in the handle, but the knife blade is something that I need to grind away, so I'm going to try to make sure that all the deep hammer marks are going to be gone. The surface texture I'm not too worried about, again, because I need to grind away a lot of that. So, but I just want to make sure that I don't have any big gouges and things that go deep into the cross section of the steel. Again, it's really important to take your time and not try to get too much done in any one heat. The last heat on this blade, and if you're working on a larger blade, it may take several heats, but you're basically just hammer refining the grain structure, and in doing that, you're also allowing a lot of the stress to work itself out of the piece. So you'll notice that I'm working at a very low heat and I'm not letting the blade sit on the anvil on any one side for any length of time, because that'll cool that side faster and create stress in the metal. So in very unscientific terms, this process is just letting the blade settle into where it wants to be. I have the knife blank sitting in a bucket of ashes to cool back to room temperature very slowly, so it'll be easier to file later on. During that time, I'm going to create a tapered poker that I'm going to use to burn in the handle. So basically I'm just forging a hot poker that matches the taper of the tang that I forged on the knife blank, and I'm going to be using that to burn in the handle rather than using the tool itself. And the main reason I'm doing that is because I want this poker to be slightly smaller than the finished tang, so that when I burn the hole in, it'll be closer to the right size. Also, this allows me to finish the blade right now. I don't have to wait till I have the handle so that I can use the actual tang to burn in the handle and then heat treat the blade. I can do everything now and basically just move on to the next process. So here's the finished forging. I left it a little large so I can grind it down to the right size once it's cold. It's also quite a bit longer than the finished tang because I just projected that taper down to a fine point that I'm going to use to burn in the handle. Here I'm setting up my filing jig in the vise because I want to be able to profile the blade now before I bend it into its final shape. This process isn't too complicated. I'm going to be using an angle grinder to get 90% of the way there, and then I'll finish off the final profile and edge bevels with the file. The beveled edge of this knife is going to be on the outside radius of the knife. So what I'm grinding now is the top surface, which is going to be on the inside of the knife. So I'm going to be bending the knife blank away from that shoulder that I'm grinding up to right now. The inside curve of the knife, which again is the flat face of the knife, determines how effective this knife is going to be. If you take a shortcut here and don't create a truly flat surface from one edge to the other, you are really compromising the amount of bevel that you're going to be able to put on that knife and its effectiveness. I've made a few of these in the past, and this is where I've always screwed them up. I rushed through this process and I created a cutting edge that had actually a convex curve, so that really blunts the edge. It feels sharp to the touch, but of course you're not cutting skin, hopefully, so that doesn't mean anything. You want to be able to hone a really fine, keen edge, so this shape has to be totally flat, and the bevel on the other side has to meet to it and make a nice fine edge. If you round over this edge even a little bit, it's amazing how it just totally destroys the whole knife. So at this point I've ground away all the hammer marks and scale, and I'm back down to a clean surface, and I'm starting to use the file to define that flat face that I'm talking about. Also, you can see how the file is hitting the high spots and leaving a lot of areas that aren't touched. So here I've jumped ahead a few minutes, and you can see that the tip of the knife has a fairly good surface, but I still need to concentrate on the back to get rid of a lot of imperfections and to develop that flat face that I need. So I'm going to stop filing at the tip for now and just concentrate on the back edge of the knife. So what appears to be me filing from the tip all the way to the back isn't actually what's happening. I'm resting my file on the tip and getting the registration of the angle that I need, and then I'm following that towards the back, and I'm starting to apply pressure about midway in that stroke. So it's only the back half of the knife that's actually getting any work done to it. The front part is really just to get my file in position so I can duplicate that angle all the way to the back. Here I'm a little further along and I have what appears to be a flat surface. At this point I'll start filing in a different direction, and I'll notice how the scratch marks are being developed on the surface. If the surface is truly flat, I'm going to get an even scratch pattern over the entire face. If not, I need to continue filing to remove the high spots. Now that I have a flat surface on the inside edge of the knife, I'm ready to start working on the other side. And once again, I'm going to use the angle grinder to get rid of the excess material. This blade is going to have a double bevel so you can follow whatever the grain is doing without having to reposition the piece. In other words, you can push the blade away from you as well as pull it towards you. And then once the grinding's done, it's back to the file and basically following the same process that I used to flatten the back. I'm going to work one bevel, get it perfectly straight, and then I'll work on the other bevel. So here's the blade about 45 minutes later. I have everything flattened out and straight, and I have the bevels established, but I've left a blunt edge. So I'm going to need to grind that when the blade is in its final shape. Now I'm ready to shape the blade. The first bend is the hardest because I need to hammer on that inside face that needs to stay perfectly flat, but I'm able to keep my hammer blows right at the top where the cutting edge really isn't going to be used anyway, so if there's any damage, it's not really a problem. Here I'm just trying to tighten up that first bend so I can get the hook to line up with the handle the way that I want. Normally I would just set this in the vise and hammer it that way, but because this is a higher carbon steel, I don't want the vise jaws to suck the heat out of the bar too quickly and create a stress point there. So I'm just working back and forth until I get the shape that I'm looking for.